for the Asian Security Conference, where the keynote address today will be given by US Defense Secretary Ash Carter. So how well has Carter's boss, Barack Obama, done during his time in the White House? Joining me is the multi-award-winning author and filmmaker, John Pilger. John Pilger, thanks for coming back on Going Underground. Let's begin with, well, Ash Carter is in Singapore for this important security summit. Lots of presidential contenders presumably looking at this summit for the future. You say in your most recent piece that Obama's worldwide campaign of terrorism is unprecedented. Why is President Obama's terms in office signal such a shift in US imperial power, as you say?
Yes, I mean, Obama's almost a perfect example of the image and the reality. The image of Obama was of this interesting, eloquent African-American man who somehow rose through this vortex of politics right to the top and would bring a kind of new civilized attitude to America. All that was nonsense. You know, Obama went to Prague in 2009 and stood up before an adoring crowd and said, the United States will help rid the world of nuclear weapons. Under Obama, nuclear warhead production is greater than under any post-Cold War president. There's something like $1 trillion have been earmarked for nuclear weapons production and development.
And yet he visited Hiroshima, as the media
but these are acts of deep cynicism. And power at that level operates, yes, in a public relations sense, and that's very much today, where The Guardian has just published a picture of Obama frolicking with his family and his dogs, and what a wonderful human being clearly this man is. The other side, the cynicism of great power, and great reckless power in many respects, is expressed at Hiroshima, where all the evidence shows that both Hiroshima and Nagasaki were sacrificed as America's first expressions of violent power in the Cold War that was then underway. So for Obama to go and talk about the atomic bombs as if God dropped them, he uses the passive voice, you know, and really quite vomitous language, like we must have the courage to care. So no one dropped the atomic bombs. The United States certainly didn't kill all those hundreds of thousands of people. It didn't cause all that suffering. It's something that we should all express sympathy to. It was like a kind of high mass, you know, so the great divinity was there, but not the United States. That's not to blame. That's been Obama's role as a PR man extraordinaire. And he came in to power, people fell on their knees. If you read mainly the liberal media, fell on their knees. This was a kind of second coming. There was a problem for the last few years with reigniting Afghanistan and Iraq and destroying Libya and so on and so forth. But the fawning has begun again as Obama's time in office nears an end. And for journalists to report that, as I say, deeply cynical action of Obama's and the United States in Hiroshima the other day, to report it without the context of all those survivors, and I've interviewed many of them, of how angry they were, many of them. But they're polite people and they're very elderly, but they were angry.
Because, of course, we're taught here at school that it ended the Second World War.
Well, we're taught a lot of things in school. We used to be taught that all Indians loved the British Empire, and the Great Famine of 1943 was somehow excluded, and that the Mau Mau were uniquely terrible people. The British did nothing in Kenya that warranted this kind of resistance, and we were taught In other words, we were taught a lot of imperial nonsense most of the time. I think I probably spent the first, after school, I probably spent the first 20 years trying to revise it, what I'd been taught.
Okay, do you think Trump and Clinton and Sanders, though, they won't be as, I mean, if you think of the coups under Obama, or certainly the US-backed changes
Libya,
of government,
yeah.
Dilma Rousseff arguably in Brazil, will things get better? Clinton, Trump or Sanders wouldn't do the kinds of things that Obama has.
They're going to be another American president. That's really, I don't really need to say any more. And those who attach a kind of false hope, and I mean a false hope, and Obama was given truckloads of this false hope, and even a kind of suggestion that they're really unusually benign creatures. Those people don't do us any service. That's very difficult to describe either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton as benign. We're going to get either, when I say we, the rest of the world, are going to get either a right-wing, classically right, America First populist in Trump, or we're going to get someone who is the absolute embodiment of the system that has run seamlessly since 1945.
Okay, but, and Sanders, actually, you've been writing about very recently, saying because he voted to destroy Yugoslavia, to put Edward Snowden on trial, he called Hugo Chavez a dictator.
Yeah,
you don't want people...
Sanders, let's get the quote exactly right. He was asked about Chavez, and he called Chavez a dead communist dictator. I don't think there's anything in Senator Sanders's foreign policy that offers any encouragement to any of us. And I think it's rather a pity that if you speak against or just simply point out the flaws, the obvious flaws in these candidates, as well as the positive side. There's no doubt Sanders has offered some kind of civilized life to the United States. It's not going to happen. He's offered health care. It's the only developed country that doesn't have a proper health care system. He wants to do something about the barons of Wall Street. Good luck. He's not going to be president. And what Sanders is doing now is almost a two-track. He's telling his supporters to go all the way to the Democratic convention, but at the same time, he's almost containing them. Because among those supporters are many, many very interesting and passionate young people who could form the basis of a great movement in the United States, a movement not unlike those in the 1960s and 1970s. And the threat to them is that a Democratic candidate like Bernie Sanders, or certainly like Clinton, will attempt to contain them, to keep them within the system. The good news is that clearly millions of these people are saying no. I'm not sure I like the term conspiracy of silence, but it's applicable to this election campaign in the United States. The United States is in a frenzy of preparation for conflict of some kind. And conflict of some kind can lead to war of the real kind against China and against Russia on two fronts. The greatest build-up of forces since the Second World War has happened in Eastern Europe and in the Baltic states. So it's very interesting.
Okay, John, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to get on to World War III in a second. That's going to be coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Plus, Amnesty International gives us its take on humanitarian catastrophe in Fallujah. All this and more in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. Well, in part 2 of our interview with John Pilger, we're now going to talk about the prospects, more prospects for global conflict. So, John, when it comes to current policy, presumably the things that you're saying are not lost on Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. They are watching all of this, let alone, I mean, I suppose Vladimir Putin watching deployment of first strike capabilities in Eastern Europe. Do you think their reactions have been too muted, that they could have done anything to stop this American expansion?
Well, I think Putin has been speaking out about it. It hasn't been reported in the West. Ukraine is now, since the US managed, US control, US paid for coup in that country, has become an American preserve.
You called it a CIA theme park.
Yes, the CIA, well, CIA are all over it. Special forces are all over it. American business is all over it. Joe Biden's son is on various Ukrainian companies as fracking companies. So the full American so-called interest has gone to a country that means borderland, and through which the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in the early 1940s with the cost of something like 27 million lives. Imagine, and this is something that we're not allowed to imagine the equivalent in the United States, the border with Mexico, the border with Canada. Well, we can imagine it because it happened when the Russians unwisely put missiles into Cuba. And we almost had then World War III. But I think what is striking in a country like the United States, which has constitutionally the freest media in the world, these war preparations against Russia and against China have not been mentioned. A great silence covers them. When China is mentioned, it's about its aggressive moves in the South China Sea. It's very interesting to see how this is being, the American public is being primed to accept so-called aggressive moves by China when in fact they're clearly defensive moves. The United States has something like 400 major bases encircling China like a great noose. Well, actually, it's an arc. It starts in Australia, it goes all the way through Asia, the Philippines, where they're back. They were thrown out a few years ago. They're back now. Thailand, Japan, and Korea. Looking straight at Shanghai is Okinawa. Okinawa has 32 American military installations. Japan has 130 in all. Imagine if, I mean, Okinawa is interesting. It's about the size of Long Island. If you imagined Okinawa as or Long Island as a Chinese base looking straight at New York, that's the equivalent.
Do you think multinational corporations, Wall Street, would allow, they haven't allowed a full-scale war from President Obama against Beijing, and surely they would
I don't know. I understand your question, and certainly China is America's first trading partner. It is a trading partner. Most of the things that Americans wear, as we do, are made in China. The things they make, China has almost replaced Japan in that sense, as the great manufacturing center of the world. So, you know, America has this close business relationship with China. I don't know is the answer to that, but I think what is interesting and dangerous, and I don't think it's been recognized, is the ascendancy of military thinking, the Pentagon in Washington. Recently, the State Department broke its silence on this and said to the Defense Department, let us handle the diplomacy, let us handle relations with countries, you do the military side of things. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was an extraordinary outburst coming from an official in the State Department where there is great frustration about this ubiquitous power now of the Pentagon. of the military. And this seems to be embodied in this Defense Secretary, Ash Carter, who seems to go from conference to conference, G7, now he's going to Singapore, he's in Singapore, threatening countries.
Okay, but surely a President Trump wouldn't do that kind of thing. He's avowedly stated...
I don't know what President Trump would do you?
Well, of course,
I don't think anyone does.
But he has clearly said that he would. He doesn't believe that, for instance, in the Baltic states, it should be American forces. From a financial point of view,
look, I think what is interesting, the difference between Trump and Clinton. And I don't think there's a great deal of difference, generally speaking. One of the differences is Trump has made very clear and repeated it that, as you say, he doesn't want to go to war with China. He doesn't want to go to war with Russia. He wonders why America is all over the world. He wonders what the power of NATO is. This is heresy.
There's this comment from a Communist Party official, Chinese official, saying that Ash Carter is playing a role in a Hollywood movie, while Carter says we cannot look the other way because of Chinese aggression. Do you think the responses to what you're talking about from Moscow and Beijing are good enough? I mean, are Russia and China not seeing things, as many steps ahead as they should be?
I think things have moved so quickly. I think there's a real recklessness now. As far as China is concerned, in the last couple of weeks, the US Navy has sent guided missile ships into this disputed zone in the South China Sea. And for the first time, Chinese fighter jets were scrambled. A week or so later, an American spy plane was intercepted by planes. I mean, anyone who understands how so many wars begin accidentally or by mistake. We had one of America's leading and most interesting generals, General James Cartwright, talk about this recently. He talked about the hair trigger system, which now gives the leaders of country only really minutes to decide whether they will launch a preemptive nuclear attack or whether they will respond to a nuclear attack. And one of the most worrying aspects, I think, is that China clearly has taken on board that it is being seriously threatened, because up till now, its nuclear weapons have been kept on low alert. That is, the weapon and the warhead have been kept separately. The US and Russia have always kept their nuclear weapons on high alert. The literature that's available now suggests that China is on high alert. Again, only last week, Chinese submarines armed with nuclear weapons went on patrol in the Pacific for the first time. None of this is even mentioned, not to my knowledge,